description, and then I'll go to the intros.
Sure, Anurag, thanks. Hello, everybody. I'm Rick Dutta, and I have Anurag Bist along with me joining in today. Welcome today to our Thai South Coast Orange County chapter event, speaker series event. Just a couple of things on these events. Moving forward, we'll be having these events every 2 weeks. So our next event will be in June 17th. As usual, we've got a terrific lineup for this month for the next 2 speakers out there. And please refer to our newsletter. And without any delay, let me hand it over to Anurag. There. Go ahead, Anurag.
Yeah, pleasure for us to invite Aditya Sood. Aditya is president of film Art Miller Inc., production banner of writers-directors Phil Lord and Chris Miller. And Aditya and I were introduced to some time back, and he has been gracious enough to accept our invitation to speak in this forum. Thank you, Aditya. And so let me briefly describe Aditya. So he was previously president of Simon Kilberg's production company, Chandra Films, for about 9 years. And while at Chandra, Aditya discovered Andy Weir's self-published novel, The Martian, and was one of the producers of the Golden Globe-winning Ridley Scott film, which actually made a lot of money in Hollywood. Most of you may have seen it. He has also done a lot of other movies, Deadpool 2, along with Murder on the Orient Express, and also in television show called Designated Survivor. Prior to working at Chandra, Aditya has worked in a lot of other Hollywood studios like Warner Brothers, DreamWorks, and New Line Cinema. And coming from Indian background, so we, I think Rick did tell, but we are actually an organization of Indian entrepreneurs. So we're really privileged to have you, Aditya, here, basically looking at what your journey has been growing up in an Indian household. So I think, first of all, thank you for joining us. And let me start asking you, Aditya, like, I think when we talked, I think the most intriguing thing for me was that the way you grew up in an Indian household with her parents. And so tell us a little bit about, like, what was your journey becoming what you have right now as top shelf Hollywood producer and involved in such award-winning films?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Anurag and Rick, for having me here. This is really an exciting opportunity to talk to you and to everybody for showing up on is it Tuesday? I don't even remember what day it is. Wednesday. So yeah, I grew up. I was born in England. My parents are from New Delhi. They're both physicians. They actually met in medical school at Maulana Azad Medical College in New Delhi in the late '60s, and got married in the early '70s, and ended up moving to England, where I was born. They actually only lived there for a year, and then. My mom's brothers and sisters all lived in the United States, and the idea was always that they wanted to emigrate here. So, I really grew up, 6 months, in the U.S., first in Newark, and then really mainly in Seattle, Washington, which in the late '70s, early '80s was not a place that a lot of people knew about. I'm pretty sure my parents didn't know where Seattle, Washington was when my dad went to interview for a residency program there. But it was an amazing place to live. And the only thing I knew at a very early age was that I never wanted to be a doctor, which, I would say like 75% of my family, including 3 of my grandparents. My grandmother really, I think, was one of the first female doctors in India. She went to medical school in the 40s. But I never wanted to do it. And the thing that I don't think I realized that I was interested in film like as a career, but I think the thing that actually got me interested in films just as films was that my parents actually we were the first people on the block who had a VCR. And this was in the early '80s, because it was really the only way for them to stay in touch with Bollywood movies. You know, Seattle at that time didn't have a very large Indian community. Basically, you were either a doctor or you were a Boeing engineer. This was sort of before Microsoft and Amazon and you know, all of the big tech companies that are sort of dominate the landscape up there right now. But my parents got this VCR. And in fact, it was such a small community at that time, there was no place to actually get Bollywood movies. So we used to pile into my parents' car. I'm an only child, so the three of us would go drive 3.5 hours up to Vancouver, British Columbia, and where there was a much larger Indian community, and we would drive on Main Street. There was it was sort of a little India neighborhood right just a little west of downtown, and we would go into one of the stores there. I think was sort of in some guy's house, and I remember we would go inside, and he would walk over and he'd turn the sign of the sign to closed, and we would follow him down into the basement of his house, where he had a large white sheet with probably 25 clearly pirated, though I don't think anyone even knew what that meant at the time, Bollywood movies that had been, you know, copies of copies of copies. And my parents would sort of study very seriously, would look at all of these tapes, and you know, would kind of very carefully pick 5 of them, and we'd get back in the car, drive back to Seattle. And then over the next 3 months, my parents would watch those movies. And this is the part that actually, when I tell people, they don't really understand, though I think everybody in the Indian community would understand. About 3 or 4 months later, they would actually then drive back to Vancouver, return those movies, and then get 5 other movies. And this was a lending library that, you know, I think for at least for a couple of years was sort of their one way, without, you know, getting on an Air India flight back to New Delhi, that they were able to sort of maintain, you know, real contact with Indian culture. So
imagine our kids today that you have to do so much to watch a movie.
Yeah. Well, the thing though that was interesting was because we had this VCR, I remember my dad, I was like a little too young to see Star Wars when it came out. My friends in school had seen it, but by the time Return of the Jedi had come out, which was, you know, 1983, I remember my dad going and getting a copy of Star Wars from the library. And, you know, I watched it at home, you know, on VHS and, you know, probably a 20-inch television, you know, just the way that George Lucas had intended. But I was completely spellbound. I'd never seen anything like it. And I feel like this is going to be a lot of piracy talk in something I probably shouldn't be talking about. But, you know, my dad had figured out basically how you could get another VCR, and he made a copy of that tape. And I did a thing that, you know, now I'm sure is very common. I have a almost 5-year-old, so you know, we watched movies over and over and over and over again. But at that time, no one did that, and I ended up basically watching Star Wars probably, you know, 2 or 3 times a day for, you know, every day for an entire summer. So I think by the end of that summer, I'd seen that movie, you know, 100+ times, and I had internalized it. I didn't even realize it, but I'd really internalized kind of some of the storytelling. That the next thing that was interesting was I remember, you know, in school we started studying Greek and Roman mythology, and my parents were teaching me, you know, about Hindu mythology at the same time. And there was something about, you know, and this was sort of, there was a lot of you know, what's his name, Bill Moyers did a interview with Joseph Campbell about the power of myth. And there was a lot of talk about how Star Wars was a myth, and as a myth was, you know, very similar to the Greek and Roman myths. And then I saw the Indian myths as well. And there was something that was just unbelievably interesting to me about that. And I think I've always had sort of a mathematical side of my mind, and that there was almost a mathematics to storytelling that really got me very interested in an early age. But I didn't know that that's something you could even do as a career. And, you know, I think for a long time, I probably, you know, I love Disneyland and Disney World. My parents would always have, you know, conferences, and we would go all the time. And I remember for a long time, like thinking that, well, that's what I want to do. I want to create, you know, rides at Disneyland. That seems like the coolest job that anyone could ever come up with. And I remember one day there was a cover of Time magazine, famous cover of Time magazine with Mickey Mouse and Michael Eisner. And it was the title of the cover story was "Why Is This Mouse Smiling?" And it was all about the Disney revival that Eisner had led sort of in the late 80s. And I remember thinking, wow, that guy must be the guy who comes up with all the rides at Disneyland. That seems like the coolest job in the whole world. And it was the first time I realized that there was actually a business component to entertainment. And, you know, and just to jump ahead a little bit, I mean, I in high school, I really did start just watching a lot of movies. And, you know, I was obviously very interested in Star Wars, but I was interested, I think, in a lot of the directors that I learned at that time, you know, had sort of gone to film school or had sort of come of age at the same time as Lucas and Spielberg. And, you know, I read the one biography of George Lucas that was in our school library, which said that he went to USC Film School. So I thought, okay, well, that's what you got to do. You got to go to USC Film School, and then that's how you get into Hollywood. And so I thought that's what I was going to do. And I applied to USC and UCLA. Actually, my wife, who works in admissions at USC, makes fun of me, not actually to the film program, but I just thought, oh, I'll just go to school and I'll like take some film classes, like not realizing that's not how it worked at all. But I ended up actually falling in love. I also applied to Pomona College, which is a small liberal arts school out in Claremont, and I actually completely fell in love with that school. And even though it didn't have a film program, I sort of made a vow to myself that I would figure out some way to go, you know, break into the film business because I was like, okay, I'm maybe close to Los Angeles. Like and you know, back then you could get from Claremont to LA in about an hour. Now I think it's probably about twice as long. But when I was in school, I basically I figured out how to get an internship at New Line Cinema, which at that time was a independent studio. With it and Miramax were like the two independent studios that had finally been able to kind of break through the hegemony of the major studios, with the, you know, the first sort of two independent studios that have been successful in, you know, since United Artists had been founded. And it was a really great and exciting place. And it had just been bought by Ted Turner. So it was, you know, freshly capitalized, but it really had this mom and pop ethos where they were just making movies that nobody else would make. And they were connecting with an audience, especially a younger audience that nobody else was connecting with. Everyone there was super young. And I just thought this was like, I just couldn't believe that anyone would let me hang out in a movie studio all day. So by the time I graduated, I was at New Line for a couple of years. And then my senior year, I actually went over to DreamWorks, which it was about a year after that studio had been founded. And, you know, I spent about 3 years working in development, and that just like was a little bit by chance, but that was very much the part of the business I was interested in. This was the group that would find material, would find scripts and books, would hear pitches, would read writers, would work with writers, and really develop the stories and the screenplays that would become the grist for movies, and then oversee those movies as they went into production. So I graduated. I ended up going to work for a producer named Mark Johnson, who is an amazing Oscar-winning filmmaker who had produced Rain Man and Good Morning Vietnam and Bugsy and all of these incredible films, and had started his own production company. And we were at DreamWorks. And when I was there, we made a couple of movies, including a movie that we loved at the time that didn't sort of get a lot of recognition, but I think since has become a real cult favorite, called Galaxy Quest, which was a really loving homage / parody / comedy, kind of in a Star Trek background. And Star Trek was another thing that I always really loved. So I did that, and then I got a call to go over to Warner Brothers to be a junior executive over there. And I ended up going over there at a really interesting time in Warner's history, where the chairman of the two guys who had run Warner Brothers incredibly successfully for 20 years were leaving, and a new chairman was coming in named Alan Horn. And then about a year after that, there was the infamous AOL Time Warner merger. And so I got a taste of what it was like, an unsuccessful taste of what it was like to be at a tech company when AOL made us all use AOL Mail for a year, and then promptly ran the stock price into the ground. And I ended up staying at Warner's for another I was there for about 6 years eventually as a vice president, oversaw a bunch of movies, and then went back to DreamWorks to run the production company of Walter Parkes and Laurie McDonald, who were the chairman of DreamWorks, actually when I had been there as an intern and in the Mark Johnson years. And we're leaving the studio to start their own company. And so my friends had now all grown up from being assistants and young executives at that company to really take over the company. And they asked me to come back and join forces with them. And so I did that for a few years. And then I had a little bit of a left turn. I was actually getting a little, believe it or not, a little burnt out on the movie business for a variety of reasons. And my other love has always been politics. And it was right on the cusp of there was a writer's strike that happened in 2007 and 2008. And at the same time, I got really excited about Barack Obama's campaign. And so I ended up going to work on the Obama campaign in 2008. And that was a really fascinating thing we can talk about a little bit later, but it ended up being another form of producing, really, in a lot of ways. And actually there was a lot of overlap, and a lot of people who I knew from the film and TV world ended up working on that campaign with me as well. And then after that, I ended up deciding I wanted to do more stuff in the film business, but I didn't want to go back to the studio. I didn't feel I was ready to go produce on my own, but I wanted to find a company where it was really led by a creative person, where studios were interested in collaborating with you, I think, on a creative level. And so it was just at that time that Simon Kinberg, who was a very successful screenwriter and was starting to become a producer, wanted to start a company. And so we ended up we got basically set up on a work equivalent of a blind date, and within 20 minutes realized that we were very simpatico in terms of the kinds of things that we wanted to do. And so we ended up, that was 2010, it was almost 10 years ago, teaming up, and had this really amazing run of Simon ended up doing a lot of he basically oversaw all of the X-Men movies for Fox, and so was involved with 6 or 7 of those movies and the spin-offs. And then I ended up basically doing the other movies at the company. So as you mentioned, I found this unpublished, or self-published, I should say, manuscript called The Martian by Andy Weir, which was like one of the greatest things I'd ever read, and got Fox to buy that, and then developed that screenplay and put it together with Ridley Scott and Matt Damon, and we went and produced that movie, which was one of the highlights of my career to date, for sure. It was a really incredible experience. And also tracked down the rights to Murder on the Orient Express, because I grew up reading Agatha Christie novels and loving those. And it just so happened when I started, the BBC had sort of for 20 some odd years been making every single Hercule Poirot story, and they had just finished, or they were just about to finish, so the rights were available. And so we grabbed those, developed a screenplay, and then I produced that movie that Kenneth Branagh starred and directed in. And then I worked on the Deadpool movies, as you mentioned, that were spin-offs of the X-Men universe, and were a radically different kind of superhero movie that was R-rated, all of these things that they said you couldn't do. I mean, we also made it for a fraction of what you would make sort of a major, one of the real flagship, at least the first one, superhero movies. And so that was a really exciting and fun experience. And and then did a little bit of television with Designated Survivor, which was a TV show that we developed. It was an idea that we had heard with a writer that we had worked with and loved, and it was a fun one for me because it was it was a little I should have mentioned, I think before I wanted to design rides for Disneyland, I wanted to be an astronaut, so I always loved astronomy, and that The Martian really scratched that itch, or started to, and Designated Survivor was kind of a way to do that with politics. And so that was a tremendous amount of fun. And we got to work with Cal Penn, who actually we made a consultant on the show as well. He had worked in the Obama White House, and so that was a really terrific experience. And then about a year ago, or a year and a half ago, I guess a year ago, Chris Miller and Phil Lord. Chris actually is one of my best friends from growing up. We grew up in Seattle together, and we've known each other since the second grade, and we all came out to Hollywood at the same time. And so they're two of my oldest friends in the business, and they had come to me a while ago and asking if I would ever be interested in sort of teaming up with them. And I said, of course, maybe we shouldn't mix friendship and business, but we said, let's give it a try. So we ended up basically, a year ago joining up. And so we've spent this last year working on a bunch of animated movies, a sequel to Spider-Verse, which they had produced, and a couple of other pictures, and then working on a bunch of things that they're going to direct. And then we're working on a couple of movies that we're just going to be producers on, that are just stories that attract us, and working with filmmakers and writers and actors that we're really excited about. So sorry, I think I was very long-winded, but that's sort of my
no, I think that's fascinating story. So I think one of the things I think which a lot of people in this webinar would like to listen or have traditional questions about is like, I think you grew up to an Indian parents, and as you know, like all Indians are like overachieving and STEM focused. You had doctor parents. So it's two-pronged question, like how did your parents react? I mean, basically you deciding to go in a different path first. And the second is a much more deeper question, and it kind of relates to what's happening around us today. I think being a person of color, succeeding in Hollywood, which is predominantly not people of color who actually at least dominate, as well as I think what kind of things you have observed, and especially today, what's happening in the world, like what is the responsibility of storytellers in basically at least talking something about true representation and racial diversity. So how do you view it?
All right, well, it's a lot of questions, so I'll break that up a little bit. On the first question about my parents, I think I was extraordinarily lucky. I said both of my parents were doctors. They're both the youngest children, and I think they were also both a little bit reluctant about being doctors. I think they had gone through a system where, they would always say, in the 8th grade, you either go into sciences or you go into arts, and, your life was kind of determined. And I think that was something, I mean, they were both really good at it, but it was something that never made a lot of sense to them. And they had a lot of interest, I think, in things outside of medicine. And so, and in fact, my mom actually gave up anesthesia right when I was in high school, because she really didn't feel like it was something that it certainly wasn't a specialty that befitted her. And so they were both, and it's probably real atypical for an immigrant family, they're both real follow your bliss people. And so I think when I said that I wanted to do this, they probably had a lot more anxiety about it than they shared with me. I always thought they were like, great, you do the thing that you want to do. I think they had seen my approach to things at that point, and when I got interested in something, I would get deeply, deeply interested. I mean, for instance, there are two trade papers, sort of the main newspapers that are written about Hollywood are now they're multiple online, but there used to be two that were printed every day, Variety and The Hollywood Reporter. And when I was about 14 or 15, I had found Variety at our local library, and I didn't really know what it was, other than I thought there was another magazine, I don't know if you remember, called Premiere Magazine, which used to be a really glossy magazine that would, have features about all of the movies that were coming out, and just a consumer publication like Entertainment Weekly, and which I would devour every month. And I just thought this was like Entertainment Weekly or Premiere Magazine on steroids, because all it was just like pages and pages of all of the stories about all of these movies that had never been made yet, that no one, you know, I mean, certainly the average person had never heard of, because they were reporting on script sales and movies going into production. And so I used to go to the library and just pore over it every week. And in fact, then I was making a list of the movies I wanted to see. And so I started keeping I think it was an early version of Excel. I used to keep a little spreadsheet of all of this, not even realizing that that was like, I mean, probably it wasn't what most people were doing, but I didn't even realize that there would ever be any value to to doing that. And so I could read Variety every week, but then I was really curious about this Hollywood Reporter. I didn't know what the deal was with it. And so I convinced my mom, I think I was 15 or 16, that I had to take, I don't want to say it's like the physics achievement test or something. And so this is, by the way, this is how I leveraged their interest in STEM into supporting my habit. I convinced my, if I said, if I can get an 800 on this test, you have to get me a subscription for a year to the Hollywood Reporter, which was like $250. My mom thought I was nuts, managed to get the score. She got it. They used to mail it to you. So you would literally get it 3 days in your mailbox, 3 days later. And again, I would just run to the mailbox, pour over it every day. And now the funny thing was, 2-3 years later, when I was at New Line, and then when I was at DreamWorks, all of a sudden, one of the assistants or one of the junior executives would have a question about, like, gosh, what are all the romantic comedies that, Columbia Pictures is developing? And I'd be like, oh, you mean that, and all of a sudden, this was before like the internet had really become a thing. And I think I got a little bit of a reputation of like being like a walking encyclopedia for this stuff. So I think I was able to, get people's, people noticed me, because I think most interns weren't able to do that. And, and then I think my parents saw me, put 50,000 miles on my car driving back and forth to go, work for free or close to free, basically, at the studios. And I think by the time I graduated, they're like, okay, he seems pretty committed to this. So I think they were very supportive. I mean, the thing that was funny was, I don't know that their friends were so supportive, right? I think let's say it's some friends who were like, wait, what are you doing? Your son's smart. Why isn't he becoming an engineer? Or why isn't he going into, whatever? And, and they said, look, this is what he wants to do. And, I'm not saying this happens in the Indian community, but there was a little bit of judgment maybe from some people. But the irony of all of it was, 2 or 3 years later, once I had started working, the same friends would call up my mom or my dad and say, yeah, so, my daughter really wants to do music. And she said, would you be willing to speak to her? Or he wants to do stand-up comedy, or he wants to do this. And, and I think to your next question, certainly when I started in the business, there were very, very few, if any, Indian faces. I think I remember there was a agent at one of the agencies who, honestly, I was too shy to even call. And then he left and he went to work for a nonprofit. There weren't any executives. There weren't, the one writer, and he hadn't even become a director yet, was M. Night Shyamalan. And I remember actually reading The Sixth Sense as a spec script, when he wrote it before the movie got produced. And I was like so blown away by that script. But again, I think I was probably like too shy to reach out to him, or, and so I think I always just assumed that it would be like I'd be the only person who was doing this. Like I didn't think, I don't know if I didn't have the vision for it, or I just thought I was an anomaly. And, and then all of a sudden, I remember having this conversation with some of the actor friends, the kids. And I felt like that was, the questions I would get asked by people who wanted to be actors, like, well, can I even make a career? I mean, there aren't a lot of Indians on television or in the movies. And I said, look, if you love this thing, you can do it. You may not have the same trajectory as Tom Cruise or as Julia Roberts or whomever, but, it really comes down to doing the thing that you love. But then it was really interesting because, 5-6 years after that, I remember I was watching NBC on a Thursday night, and I realized every single show had an Indian co-lead or, supporting actors. I mean, it was, in fact, there was one show that was entirely an Indian cast. I forget what it was called, but, and there was a real explosion that happened and has continued to happen. And now, I mean, I see, I see Indian names all the time, and I mean, certainly people who are younger than me, and it's great just to see that, none of them have to feel the pressure of being the first or the only one. And, you're not, you're always going to be a little bit of a smaller group, but I think it's just become over time, and hopefully this is happening. I think it is happening over a lot of different, groups, just more common and democratized. And I think that's the other thing too, is that just the industry, as tough as the industry is, I think there's certain things that have made access a little bit more democratized. It's not anywhere to where it needs to be, but at least you may have chances to kind of get in and find people who are going to believe in you. And I think the last slide. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think the last part was basically just responsibility. Like how do you view it? Like as you represent the storyline or stories.
Well, look, here's the thing. I don't subscribe to this thought that only certain people can tell certain stories. I think that great storytelling is about it's about a lot of things, but part of it is synthesizing human nature and expressing that back to an audience. And I think that great artists can come from anywhere, and I think people can find that universality amongst a lot of different groups. That being said, there are subtle details and observations that I'm going to have about what a Punjabi family in the United States family reunion. I'm going to notice certain things. If I wrote about it, I would be able to write about things that just a little detail that would give you an authenticity that someone else might not be able to do. And but I think of it a lot. I think a lot about when Francis Ford Coppola made The Godfather. That book, which was a best-selling book, and it was actually very controversial because I think the Italian American community felt that this could be really, belabor these stereotypes of, the mafia and organized crime, but and as being sort of, pervasive. But if you watch that movie, you can tell that he was able to tell the story, that familial story, with such love and attention to detail and specificity that interestingly, almost the more specific he got, the more universal it was, because you're like, wow, my family has a version of that too. That, chaotic Sunday dinner, my family has a version of that, that I can recognize. And so I think the great thing about just the diversity of voices is when people feel comfortable and confident in their their expression of things that they think are so unique to themselves, you actually make things more accessible to more people.
Yeah, so Aditya, just on the same theme of storytelling, right? My question would be related to evolving format. So I know you mentioned about you've done Martian on one side of the movie side of it, the TV series, the Designated Survivor. We also saw, like in late 1990s, Warner Home Video and Disney were my customers, and I saw them grow up to be a few $100 million company to become multi-billion-dollar companies at that time. We also since then saw the changeover to movies on demand, right? This whole VOD, right? And now mobile platform viewing with Quibi, right? So I think it would be interesting for our audience to hear from you, your perspective about this movie storytelling, how it's going to be influenced by this change in this format, for in general, and also what do you think how it would change your way of viewing, or way you would focus on or not focus on?
Sure. Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, look, I think the truth of the matter is, filmmaking and technology have been intimately linked since the beginning of the industry. And, like a really good example is, movies used to be, they used to be 4:3, like television used to be 4:3. And then once television came along, the movie studios all said, okay, well, we got to give people something that, you can't get on television. And that's when widescreen, movies were, widescreen lenses were developed. And the thing that does is it doesn't just give you something that you can't get at home. It starts to change the nature of the stories that you want to tell. And so all of a sudden, all of those epic movies all came in the 50s and, you know, 10 Commandments, Lawrence of Arabia, Sound of Music. Those were all movies that were influenced heavily by the fact that you now had this medium that no one had anywhere else. And I think you're just seeing this over and over and over again. So, you know, now with, you know, with television is a great example, you know, for such a long time, you know, TV, when it was, you know, predominantly commercial television, you know, with commercial breaks, and there was like a very formal structure to, you know, how, you know, sitcoms or dramas would work. They would have a very kind of regimen, and they still do, but like a very regimented structure. But then when HBO came along and said, guess what, you don't need commercials, and you can tell stories that end up being a little bit more free flowing, I think it made those stories what we would have called more cinematic. And I think as a result, you know, those shows actually became more interesting, and then started attracting a lot of the filmmakers and the writers that would do movies, because now all of a sudden they could tell a story, you know, over 50 hours instead of in 2 hours. And so, you know, again, I think like in this golden age of television, the thing that you get, I think there's a killer thing that movies do that television doesn't do, and then there's a great thing that television does that movies can't do. And for television, it's that you can have depth. You can go into Tony Soprano for 75 hours to see what makes this guy tick, and you can, or Don Draper, or you know, any of these, and I don't think it's surprising that you've seen all these anti-heroes that have kind of emerged as a result, because that's a really fascinating thing to go explore. I think what movies can do, because they tend to be 2-hour closed-ended stories, is they're great at catharsis. They're great at what is the change that happens in somebody's life. And in fact, I think television is actually not necessarily great at that, because if you think about every great television show, in fact, the better the television show, the more people hate the same thing about it, which is the ending, which never feels satisfying, for a variety of reasons, and partly because it's not designed to end. So, you know, I think whatever format we're going to be seeing things in, and, you know, I'm not sure if Quibi has answered that question. I mean, clearly it seems like a, you know, it's a noble experiment, but in some ways it's almost trying, I think, in a lot of ways, just to duplicate the experiences you get in movies or in television already, that, you know, may not be as satisfying actually in that format. And so, and it'll find its own thing, and it'll find a way to use its own medium to tell stories that you just can't tell in another format. And that's when it's really going to become successful. I mean, certainly YouTube, you can see that, you know, has found all sorts of, you'd call them mini genres of, you know, filmmaking, that just, you know, unboxing videos didn't exist when YouTube didn't exist. So now that's you know, my son will watch them for hours. So.
Yeah, no, that's a great perspective from you, you know, how you saw this evolution out there. And and just on the same theme, I would ask you the same question, since you mentioned about the business side of it. How do you sort of balance between the studio demands, right, of making money, and your creative standards? That would be an interesting for our audience to hear. Okay, as you continue through this journey.
Well, look, I mean, I think the best version is when those two things aren't in opposition to each other, and I don't think they have to be. I think sometimes, you know, as you know, you can understand there's a certain small c conservatism that comes from representing, you know, the bank, if as it were. And I've been on that side too. I've been on the studio side, and you know, and if you're a filmmaker and you want to do something that's unique and new, you know, you're asking somebody to really make a bet on you, and you're asking them to have faith in the creative choices that you're willing to make. And so, you know, I think the only way to do that is to build up a level of trust with the studio, and that comes from a track record. It comes from a working relationship. It comes from, you know, real vision on the part of studio executives, and I think there's some studio executives who have really had a reputation and made a career out of being bold in that way. And it also comes sometimes, I would say, we joke about this a lot, but it's like you actually have to smuggle it in sometimes. You have to actually like you give, you know, you can think of it as like you give the sugar pill of something that is really comfortable and easy, but you're actually stuffing it with things that are really kind of, you know, unique and subversive and subverting all of the expectations that people have of genres. But, you know, the truth of the matter is it almost always is on the page before it's anywhere else. So you better have a really good screenplay if you're going to try that. You know, with Deadpool, which was not a screenplay, I developed it, you know, Ryan Reynolds and Paul Wernick and Rhett Reese and Tim Miller all had worked on this script for, you know, years before we came on board. And that was one where they had really broken apart the superhero genre in such a brilliant way that, you know, we also were willing to make the movie for a lot less than we would have, you know, than a lot of superhero movies would. And that can help too. If you're willing to be cheap, sometimes people will let you take some chances.
So I have a kind of a related question, Aditya. So I think I think you and I had talked and we had discussed this dichotomy between TV and film that you just described. You do both of them. So I think in your choices that you make in terms of script or actors, is there a difference, or is the storytelling pretty much is the focus and you kind of decide based on your gut but based on your creative gut what to do? So that's one. And the second is like, and it happens more and more now, like we are getting so much overload of content on Netflix and Prime that when you start seeing something, you start almost seeing the same kind of content. And when you and I had talked, we said that that's kind of not necessarily a good thing, because once in a while you have to kind of take a bet and create a Parasite, which may win an Oscar, which may win Oscar. So what are your thoughts about that? Like, what are the differences and nuances, especially coming from a creative world, when you make decisions? How does it? What is your thought process in making those decisions?
So look, on deciding whether things should be film or television, I think it always depends on what the material that you're looking at, you know. And you know, the old rule of thumb was, you know, basically if you had a story that could only be told once, it would almost always be a film. If you had a story, or you had actually more likely a venue or characters that you could kind of revisit over and over and over again, you know, it would be a television show. So if you want to tell a story about, you know, two Boston stories, if you want to tell the story about, you know, a kid who's a janitor at MIT who's actually a secret math genius and then finds out like how to transcend his life, that's a movie. That's Good Will Hunting. If you want to tell a story set in Boston about a group of like denizens at a bar who like have comic adventures every week, that's a great TV show. It's Cheers. You know what I mean? And so like that's certainly the old way of thinking about it. Now, you know, I think increasingly the nature of television shows are allowing much more serialized, you know, stories, and so you can, you know, you'll tell things with a very long sweep. You know, Game of Thrones obviously is like the best example of that. You know, where you are building a world and really want to explore the nooks and crannies of it, and obviously like what I said before about the, you know, the characters. I think you can do that in television. But you know, sometimes you just have a really good close-ended story that is just about a single character change, and those are things that work so well as movies. Like, you know, The Big Sick, you know, I thought you could do a television show based on those characters, but there was something about just the beginning, middle, and end of that story that worked so beautifully as a movie that I would have a hard time seeing it another way. But you know, look, there are plenty of examples of people who, you know, are of projects that, you know, start in one thing and then they, you know, and then they kind of take on a new life. ER was a very famous example. It was a screenplay that they had been developing for 15 years and never could make, and then decided one day to make it as a television pilot. It became the second most successful television show in Warner Brothers history. You know, I think it used to be the case, like if you had a really big book, like when I say big book, I mean like a really successful book, it would almost always be a film adaptation. And then people would always ask the question, why is the movie not as good as the book? And it would be like, well, you had to leave so much out of it because you only have 2 hours to tell that story. But now you can take those books and tell them over 10 hours, and really, in some ways, I think, for some stories, do greater justice to them. So, there's a convergence in terms of the filmmakers and the talent and the actors. I mean, there really is no difference now. I mean, you're seeing the biggest movie stars in the world doing television and going back and forth, and the biggest screenwriters and showrunners are doing, each other's medium all the time. I think it depends on the movie. And look, there's no doubt that right now television is ascendant, and the business model of television in a lot of ways is easier because of for a variety of reasons. But I think that can also change, and I think it might change in some ways because I think right now there's been this arms race almost on the film side of making the biggest, loudest movies possible for a variety of reasons, partially because that's how you break through a very oversaturated media environment. But I think with the advent of streaming, with the advent, potentially of studio-owned theater chains, you might see studios pivoting back towards, doing what we used to call the movies in the middle, the sort of the not $150 million blockbusters, but the 2 movie stars and a concept, or a simpler genre that's not trying to appeal to everybody, but again is getting really specific. The best ones get really specific about what they do, and I think that's exciting. I think as people who like telling stories, you want to have a real ability to work in a lot of different milieux.
Yeah, you also mentioned about, Aditya, about your brief stint in the political world a bit. It would be interesting to hear from you really a couple of things, your experience and how it relates to movies, and maybe tying it back to even the things you're seeing in today's of COVID-19, politics playing in and all that. Your perspective of it in terms of how it would influence, if at all, your movie making or your storytelling.
Well, look, I think there are a lot of similarities. The stuff I was working on was primarily campaign work, and in some ways it didn't. I ran a team that was involved in the first Obama campaign, and we were responsible basically for building these phone banks and building these sort of these large trips to send people to swing states to register voters and turn out voters, and you couldn't help but feel that there was like kind of a production model to it all, right? Like you knew what your release date was, and you better have people show up that day, and that was a very similar thing. And the particular iconography that actually was also really similar was, I was based in Los Angeles, that's where I live. We ended up, by the end of that campaign, actually doing these mega phone banks where we'd have, I think eventually on election day, we had like 500 people. We actually got sound stages. And so we actually, we were in stages, which I don't know if I had shot in any of those stages, but I think I've shot some stuff since, and you were trying to figure out how to feed these people, how to get the logistics of all of it, to work, how to, it felt like a movie production. You had a call time, you had people, coming in shifts. And so there was a real feeling, and there were some other people on the campaign who also had come out, like I said, from the film and TV world. My one, it's now since outdated, but I did appreciate it. I did enjoy it at the time. My one innovation, I think, to campaigns was, so when we do production, when you have screenplays, they're printed on white paper, but when you're in production and you do revisions, you end up printing it on different colored paper so you can keep track of, make sure everyone has the most recent script. So back in 2008, when we would do these phone calls and you would have people call various swing states, we got to the point, initially California was supposed to just win Nevada, but we did such a good job of like overpowering that state. The campaign basically gave us a bigger and bigger portfolio of swing states to call, and we would be connected to headquarters in Chicago, and they'd call up and they'd see, okay, great, we're good in North Carolina. We need to now have people call all the swing voters in Iowa. and you had to like change on a dime. And my innovation was, and back then, now it's all on the computer, but back then you'd have printed lists, was I introduced colored revision pages for different states. So we pull out all the cherry pages. Now let's, you know, distribute the goldenrod pages. So it felt a little like a production at that point too. But yeah, but in terms of, you know, the other thing though that I think really similar between the two is that the importance of narrative, you know, the importance of telling a story, the importance of, you know, being able to hook an audience and move them. I think, you know, that was really a centerpiece of the Obama campaign. I thought the storytelling skills that they brought to that were pretty remarkable, and you know, and also it's like, it was meaningful. And I think, you know, I do think that every movie, whether you like it or not, has a message and a theme. And if you're going to spend all this time working on these things, and it's difficult, you know, you want it to be meaningful in some way. You don't want it to be, you know, preachy. You don't want it to be overwhelming and like you lose the entertainment value. But I think that was one of the things that Obama was brilliant at doing, was he could tell very moving stories and actually be very entertaining at the same time. And I think it opened up people's minds to thoughts that, you know, a lesser politician wouldn't have been able to engage them with.
Do you think
so I think it's a
COVID-19
good.
would have, no, go ahead.
Go ahead, Rick.
No, I will just a brief follow-up on that. The COVID-19, what's happening in the thing,
Yeah.
would it sort of influence anything? Just a quick perspective from you.
Yeah, no, I mean, listen, it's funny because all of a sudden, you know, we realize, I kind of have a pet theory that, you know, movies are a little bit of leading indicators of you know, the zeitgeist and the political zeitgeist. And, you know, for a long time I thought, you know, if you look at the great movies of the 70s, and if you look at the great movies of the early 70s, you know, The Godfather, The Conversation, All the President's Men, I mean, these are movies that people revere, but they're all movies that are set in, you know, very not cynical, but very dark, very, you know, call them paranoid. You know, there's a lot of distrust of big institutions, whether it's the government or the media or you know, war. I mean, all of that stuff that ends up, you know, people had a very sort of dim view of. But then if you look at, you know, in the 1970s, you were facing all of those same things. You were facing a government that people were not supportive of. You had unpopular war, you had economic distress, unemployment, all of those things that, you know, led to a feeling of you know, disenfranchisement. But then if you look at sort of in the latter half of the 70s, things kind of changed. And all of a sudden, the movies that became really popular were movies like Star Wars and Close Encounters and Superman and, you know, E.T. And they're all stories of communities really coming together and looking for optimistic solutions. And so I've just sort of felt for a long time that that's actually what audiences crave and want, you know, are going to want more of, because I think we are facing a lot of those similar issues right now. I mean, I think that's really, I mean, it was a happy accident, but I think that's really what The Martian was. Like, that was a movie that is about the world coming together to solve a problem using science, defending the values of civilization, whatever you want to say about it. And I think there was a reason why it was resonant. I mean, obviously Drew Goddard and Ridley Scott and Matt Damon did a brilliant job of interpreting that. But I think in a similar way right now, you know, there's a lot of stories that we have that are wittingly or unwittingly about how do you rebuild after a catastrophe. And I think that is something that on the other side of this, like how do you reorganize society, even not explicitly, but it's just like the movies are kind of about that. And I think you're going to see a lot of that.
So I think it's a good segue, Aditya, to go to some of the audience questions. So we see a lot of good questions from there. As you can imagine, like we have a lot of interest regarding the intersection of Bollywood and Hollywood. I think we erroneously looked up some credit from IMDb or you at Bollywood, but it's not there. But growing up as an Indian, I'm sure it's been in your background. So I'll just do a couple of questions regarding that.
Sure.
So I think Dipali and Amit are asking about since you are from Indian descent, you may have been exposed to Bollywood at some level. ever influenced by it, and how do you feel about Indian cinema and Indian actors? And there's a related question to it from Amit saying that some Bollywood actors have shown a desire to make it to Hollywood with varying success. How do you see this connection evolving in future? So we have, I think there's some good ones and some not so good ones we have seen. Like I was surprised to hear, I think we had a very good actor passed away, Irfan Khan, and
Yeah.
it was really nice to see Tom Hanks comment about what I mean about his coolness. So what are your thoughts about this?
Sure. I mean, look, I think um, there's no doubt that just as things have, what used to be movies that you would get pirated on a basement floor now are available everywhere, and filmmakers, always, I think, are taking in, the best filmmakers are taking in influences that extend far beyond just the mainstream. So I think it can't help but be pervasive. In terms of the specific artists, I mean, I think there's some incredible filmmakers, and I think Irfan Khan was unbelievable. I mean, he actually was, we had cast him in The Martian initially, and then unfortunately he had to drop out because he had a Bollywood movie, which no one could quite understand. It was, he had shot half of it and they had stopped production, and then he had to go for the second half of the production, and it literally blew the mind of everybody. I'm like, no, this is kind of what happens sometimes. It's a little bit of a different structure, but I think that there's I'm trying to think what's the best way to sort of put it. I think in terms of people crossing over, there's, in the same way that, like, you think about, like, some American stars could cross over into Bollywood movies and some couldn't. And I think you're going to see, there's some people, there's sometimes a style to the acting, or a style to the performance that may lend itself better for some people, and not, and it may be a little bit more of a challenge for others. I think Irfan Khan, the kinds of movies he was making, really lent himself well to crossing over and being in mainstream American movies, I think, in a way, certainly as a dramatic actor. But I think the sky's the limit. I think you're just going to see a ton of it happen. I think India is such an interesting market also, because it is both English speaking, but also has an incredibly robust tradition of local language films. And so sometimes there's, my parents grew up watching, I guess more technically British films than American films, but they watched everything, and so there's a real fluidity, I think, in terms of movies working well overseas. I think some also that it's interesting. I mean, I have to admit, I'm not as up on sort of the most current Bollywood movies, but there's obviously, like, subject matter and things like that I think you have traditionally have had more flexibility doing in the U.S. And seeing that, hopefully there's an ability now for things to get more, especially as it goes to television as well, more, I don't know, progressive is the right word, or if it's, it breaks out of, I think, some of the more sort of standard fare.
Rick, you want to go next? Maybe pick up a couple of questions. You're muted, Rick.
Sorry, I was asking the questions. I was muted here. Sorry about that. On the same theme, I saw a couple of questions out there. I'm trying to club it together.
Mm-hmm.
One is related to, we see the success naturally of Hollywood, we see the success of Bollywood, and we are starting to see Amazons of the world now producing in Bollywood there. What do you think the Hollywood studios and the Hollywood people producing in Bollywood, or producing Bollywood style of themes, which is really for Bollywood, that type of a thing? And the other question would be related to it. Would you do one of those type of things? Right.
So let me just try to rephrase that. So you're saying, in terms of, we're seeing bigger studio American companies going in and making shows, and yeah, I mean, I think that's really exciting. And yeah, I mean, there definitely are, you know, there are a couple of books that I've been interested in that I'm not going to talk about today just because we haven't gotten the options on all of them yet, but that are things that you could definitely do as a local, I don't know if you would do it as a local language thing or you would do it as, like, you know, fundamentally an American production that was made there, but you would want to do it, you know, with local crew and with, you know, local actors. Yeah, and I think, again, it's like I remember there was the Netflix show. There was the police procedural in set in Bombay. Gosh, what was it called? It was based on a novel last year. That it was so fascinating to watch it because you were basically watching
Sacred Games.
Sacred Games. That's right,
Games.
Sacred Games.
Yeah.
And you were watching it, and it was like watching an American or an English show with all the Indian actors. Like the aesthetic of it was very, you know, sort of what we would consider sort of like a mainstream thing. And so that was like an exciting, I don't know how that played in India, for instance. Like I found it really interesting here. But yeah, I mean, I think it all depends on what the storytelling, you know, where the story leads you. And, you know, look, the exciting thing is also now you don't, you know, not to contradict what I said earlier, but, you know, it's not that you can only do an Indian movie, you know, a movie set in India if you get the biggest American or English director to go direct it. You know, one funny story that happened to me was when I was at Warner Brothers, I actually optioned, this young writer had written a screenplay about the building of the Taj Mahal. And I thought that was, you know, I've always thought this is an incredible story. And I actually ended up optioning it when I was there because I said, okay, well, look, this is not the kind of thing that we normally do, but maybe there is a way to figure this out. And you know, and it wasn't a super expensive thing. Like we just, you know, we ended up sort of picking it up. But you know, there was a little story in Variety or whatever whenever we optioned the script. It got picked up by the press wire in India, and all of a sudden, headline: Warner Brothers to make Taj Mahal film, right? And because my name had been in the story as the executive on it, all of a sudden it got mentioned, and I started getting phone calls, and my phone number was listed. I started getting phone calls in the middle of the night, which would have been the middle of the day in India, from, you know, an actor or an actress saying, "Sir, my life's dream is to work in Hollywood. You know, please consider." I mean, this went on for weeks. I mean, I had to start just taking my phone off the hook at night. And you realize that there was such an appetite and such a hunger for, you know, for, I think, Indian stories to be recognized and to be told. Now, I mean, you probably need to do it less now from Hollywood. You can do it from India, you know, but there was like a validation that almost seemed to come with that. That I understood why, even though it ended up just being a development project, not something we ever made. But it was, I think it was foretelling something for sure.
So I have a couple of very interesting questions. So the one is that what's a book or other piece of IP you have cherished for a really long time and would love to turn to a film, TV show, and why? I guess some of it maybe you cannot talk, but whatever you can.
It's always a little bit hard. I mean, you know,
Yeah.
like I said, there are a handful. There's I don't want to be vague, but it just because they're all in kind of pretty early stages. But you know, there's I mean, one thing, there are two Andy Weir books that I'm working on now. You know, the author of the Martian of his next two books that we're in development on, both of which I think are really special movies. One, which has been published, is called Artemis, which is it's a crime thriller that's set on a lunar colony, but with a 22-year-old Saudi girl who lives on the moon as a lead, which I think is really an amazing opportunity to tell, a story that no one has ever told before, and to be matter of fact about it, which I think is really cool, but also to let that really infuse the storytelling. And so that's something I'm really excited about. We're also doing, we just announced that Kristen Filler is actually attached to direct both of these, but they're also attached to direct Andy's next book, which comes out in March of next year, that Ryan Gosling is going to star in, called Project Hail Mary, which is I think it'd be a pretty amazing movie. I don't know how much about that the story I can talk about, but I think that's one that also could be really. He has such a unique gift of being able to tell very heavy duty science stories, but in incredibly entertaining ways. And so you're able to, if you like the science, to go as deep into that as you want. But if you just like good storytelling, I think he's really pretty exemplary. So it's fun to work on stuff with him.
Cool. So I think I have one other question, probably time for one more question, and then Rick will wrap up. So I think there are a couple of questions which I'll try to combine. So one is about tension between realism versus fantasy in the arc of storytelling. For the streaming medium, which end of spectrum seems to work better in your options? And kind of related question to that is that people are taking less risk towards making in the movie business. They're taking much more risk in the TV business in terms of different kinds of stories. So probably that's related to the financials and the amount of money you put in. But what are your comments regarding those?
Actually, I don't fully understand the first question, so let me just answer the second question back first, and then we'll go back to the first one. So in terms of like the relative risk in your storytelling, I don't want to reject that premise. I think it is true to a degree, and you're able to do things in television that you probably can't do or don't seem to be able to do in film. But at the same time, I think the movies that are actually breaking out and the movies that are sticking with people beyond, the Star Wars sequel or the Avengers sequel or sort of the predestined large franchise movies are actually the ones that tend to be the most interesting and unique and feel authentic. So, Crazy Rich Asians, I think, is a great example of that. That was it's a really simple romantic comedy on the one hand, but it's really bold and exciting in terms of the world it's in terms of the representation of the characters, that story that it's telling. And again, I think that was a movie that was not afraid to revel in its specificity. And I think as a result, it ended up really connecting with audiences in a really big way. And I would say that is a risky movie. Small, I mean, it's not an unbelievable risk movie, but it's not a typical movie that people would take a chance on. So, I think that's been a real thing for us philosophically with, certainly for myself and certainly for Chris and Phil, of, wanting to do things that might not necessarily seem like great, obvious ideas. I mean, they made a movie out of Lego bricks that ended up being the most like sublime, beautiful, movie of that year. They made another animated Spider-Man movie after, there'd been 7 live action ones, and that was a pretty beautiful thing. No one had ever made a successful movie set on Mars. In fact, I remember having a conversation with, they're not there anymore, but with some marketing people at the studio who are like, do it need to be called The Martian? We saw some posters and there wasn't really any Mars on the poster, some early ideas. And you're like, no, you have to kind of own the thing that you have, even if, 5 people have failed at doing it, because if you're authentic, I think you have a chance to connect. I think audiences are really sophisticated. I want to try to unpack that first question. Sorry. So the question,
I think it was more about like, just like whether there's always tension between realism versus fantasy, and so the question was whether it works better in TV versus film.
I don't know. I mean, I think traditionally people have said that television has been, it's more of a place where you can do kind of searing dramas. I mean, but you used to be able to do that more in film as well. I mean, I like to tell everyone the highest grossing movie of 1979 was Kramer versus Kramer. And it made more money than a Star Trek movie, Alien movie, a Muppet movie, because that's what people used to go to movies to see. But but then obviously you can make amazing spectacle now on television. Everyone's got a 4K, high resolution television at home, and you can, do pretty spectacular things. So maybe there's more interchangeability between it. I do feel there is something magical about going to see a movie. And in fact, the more sort of earthbound the movie, on a big screen, it's actually kind of an amazing experience. I'll use the Big Sick as an example again. I remember seeing that at the Cinerama Dome, which is, and if you've been to LA, is like one of the biggest movie theaters. It's usually where you go and see the new Chris Nolan movie or the new, Spider-Man movie or whatever. But just happened to be that weekend, there weren't a lot of other movies playing, and they put it on the biggest screen. And it was an amazing experience because this was a story. It's an intimate story about, people not understanding each other. And there's a lot of scenes at dinner tables and, stuff that no car chases in that movie. But when you see that movie, when you see people blown up to this like supernatural size, I think there is something that is so magical about movies that, they haven't been able to replicate in television yet. And I don't think I ever will, because I think it is just fundamentally a different thing. That, that was a case of realism working beautifully in a movie. But, I love movies with a lot of spectacle too. So try to do a little bit of both.
Aditya, thank you so much for your time. I know we have extended your time a bit. We had mentioned about an hour to you, but seems like there were so many interesting questions. So I really appreciate, first of all, on behalf of Thai Orange County chapter, that you took the time with us to spend a bit of time. Okay. With us. Thank you again. And we look forward to, keeping in touch with you. Thank you again.
Yeah, we'd
Really good to see you.
love to have you in person sometime when things open up. And thanks again, Aditya. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, everybody.